up, friends? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about white in watercolor. There are lots of different ways that you can paint or paint around the whites in watercolor, and today I'm going to demonstrate just 5 of those methods. Of course, because watercolors are transparent paints, the number one way to try to create your whites in watercolor is going to be to use the white of the paper. I'm going to demonstrate that first because when you're getting started that can be a little bit tricky, but it's also the best way to ensure that you have luminous transparent paintings with lots of that white paper showing through. Choose your tools to fit your style of painting so that you can create art that you're proud of. Now before we start, I want to mention that your paper quality is really important, especially for some of the techniques we're going to be using today. So I will be using Fabriano Artistico 140 pound cold pressed cotton watercolor paper. 100% cotton is the best when you're working with watercolors. It's the toughest paper, it's the most resilient, and when we do techniques like lifting, for example, you're going to want to make sure that your paper is high quality. I will be demonstrating all 5 of these techniques on the same exact painting for your viewing pleasure. We're going to work from this beautiful photo from Pixabay of this close-up shot of a cat's face. I'm really excited to show you all these ways to create luminous whites. Let's get into it. Now with watercolor, you have to plan ahead for your whites, especially if you want to use the white of the paper for your most luminous whites in your painting. So unlike oil paints or some of the more opaque mediums, which you can just kind of start by just brushing on all kinds of color and letting the drawing sort of emerge, we can't do that so much with watercolor. We need to do a sketch in advance and really plan ahead and prepare before just jumping in. And so today, to demonstrate best practices, we are going to begin with a sketch. Now when I talk about planning ahead for your whites, there's a bright highlight here in the eye. Let me just draw the black pupil first, right in the center. So there's the pupil, and then the highlight goes right next to the pupil. And we're going to need to plan ahead for that so we don't cover it up with our dark paint. Once you're confident that your sketch is ready, you can start with painting. So the first method of white I'm going to show you is masking fluid. Now masking fluid comes in all different forms. This is Pebeo drawing gum. It's blue, which I like because it shows up easy on the white paper for easy removal, so I know where I put it. Now something with masking fluid is that it does destroy your brushes if you're not careful. So I have a bar of soap right here and a little tiny brush. I'm going to dip my brush in the water and then dip it on the soap or scrub it on the soap, thoroughly coating the bristles with the soap before dipping into my masking fluid. I'm going to be using the masking fluid for a couple of the whiskers just to demonstrate how this works. The tinier the brush, the better. Try and complete each whisker in a nice long line. This can be a little bit tricky, just do your best. But if you're using masking fluid, it will preserve the white of the paper underneath and you can paint freely and easily over the top. That's the best part about it. So you're preserving the purity of just the white of the paper, which if there are any purists out there, this should make you happy because it's not introducing any opaque media or other media, no mixed media here. When we remove the masking fluid, it will reveal the pure white of the paper underneath. And the best part about this is that when you have these delicate white details that are surrounded by more flat areas of color, you can paint quickly and freely over the top of the masking fluid once it's dry without worrying about losing those whites. So it should be very freeing for you once you've done this hard work of actually laying down the masking fluid. And I say hard work because it's tricky to use this stuff. Sometimes it globs on a little bit thick and you're not going to get the thin, skinny line that you want. If that happens, just remove it and start over. Notice how I'm having to kind of retrace my lines a little bit here and there. Now I'm going to leave the rest of the whiskers for a different medium just to show you other ways that I use white. Rinse your brush right away and do not use your masking fluid rinsing water for paint. Those two do not mix. So we need to let this dry for about 10 minutes, and while that's drying we can work elsewhere in the painting. So I'm going to show you now how to negative paint around white shapes. We have large enough white shapes in the eye that I think we can pretty easily paint around those. So what is negative painting? Negative painting is when you paint around an object instead of painting the object itself. In this case, we're negative painting around these highlights in the eye. This is my favorite way to leave the whites in watercolor, or to produce white in watercolor, is to simply paint around them. And it is the most pure way to work with your whites. It's just to leave the white of paper. We don't really use white paint in watercolor. We do have it, and I'm going to show you my Dr. P.H. Martin's white in a bit, but it's for one of those things you want to save for the end and just for little details, because generally when you're working with watercolor, most of your white should be the luminous white of the paper. Another way to negative paint around your whites, this is a tricky thing for some people, is where you have black and white overlapping in all of this delicate detail. So right here in the corner of the eye is a great example of that. I'm going to take the tip of my brush and pull the wet indigo down using a controlled downstroke and allowing some separation between those brush strokes. Very gentle parallel motion that looks like white fur overlapping dark fur. Here's another example of negative painting. See that little strip of white right there? That's a tiny glimmering highlight, perhaps of moisture on the underside of the eye, that I've left untouched with paint. And that's just the white of the paper, no white paint needed. But as I said at the beginning, it does require planning ahead. Now, before I can demonstrate some of the other methods of using white, we're going to need to do some wet on wet washes to get some color down on the fur. Now I'm going to show something while I'm working this way. I'm going to demonstrate another technique you can use to create white, and that is lifting. Now for this, make sure that you're using paints that are non-staining. And you can usually find out if your paint has that property. Usually the tube will tell you if it's staining or non-staining. I'm using ultramarine and burnt sienna, which are both non-staining. And so I'm going to actually purposely cover up this area on the cat that's going to be white. I'm going to cover it up and make it too dark right now. And then I'll show you how we can restore the white of the paper with lifting. I know sometimes we can freak out if we accidentally cover up something that we wanted so badly to preserve, but don't freak out. So what we'll do is we'll take a stiff synthetic brush, something like this, a little scrubber brush I have here, and make sure that it's wet but just damp. So I'm going to blot on the paper towel to remove any excess water. And then I want to restore the white of the paper right under the eye here. So I'm just going to gently scrub, remove that paint on my paper towel, and go in again until I get the white back to where I want it to be. And with burnt sienna and ultramarine, as I said, because these are non-staining, they lift really easily. But make sure that you're going in and wiping that paint off on a towel or a sponge or something so that you're not accidentally just reintroducing it back into the painting. Makes sense, right? You lift and remove, wipe on a sponge or paper towel, and then go back until you're satisfied with how much of your white was restored. I really like how that looks. Now you're back in business. It's a great way to create the look of a lighter value inside of a shape that is also softly rendered and not so harsh.
If you're enjoying this video and would like to see the full-length, real-time, fully narrated version of this cat tutorial, it is available through my Watercolor Mastery membership. Included in the membership are the daily challenges, which are very popular. They're so much fun because they're just 20 minutes and they help you paint something every single day. With each tutorial, you get a reference photo and traceable line drawing if you're not comfortable with the sketching part. So I hope I see you over there. I'll leave a link in the description so you can check out the membership.
So last is to add our final white details. I have a couple of tools I can use for that. I have my Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. This is my favorite opaque white watercolor. It's wonderful. I'm going to clean up my palette a little bit so I have room for some white here. I also have a couple of white pencils. This is a white charcoal pencil and this is a white colored pencil. So we're delving into the world of mixed media when we work with whites using pencils, but you know, for things like fine fur details, it looks really cool. So actually let's start by removing our masking fluid, revealing our perfect white whiskers. And now we're going to add some additional whiskers using our white opaque paint. So you just load up your brush, make sure you're using a nice tiny brush. And we can actually use this to touch up those whiskers if your masking fluid didn't do a perfect job and kind of skipped over a little bit. Your white opaque paint can complete those shapes, and you can use the very tiny brush to feather the end of each whisker so that it goes from skinny to fat, back to skinny again. And adding a little bit of water will thin your paint and make it less intense white. So just be aware of that. Same with gouache if you choose to use gouache. So white opaque acrylic or white watercolor that's opaque like this works so well for whiskers. I think it's probably the easiest way to paint whiskers. And notice how slowly I'm moving so that I can get a, oops, messed that one up a little. I was going to say perfect, but so I can get a decent white line here. The slower you go, the more evenly your paint will release on the paper. So you do see a subtle difference between the opaque white and the pure white of the paper. They are not the exact same thing. That's why I want to show you all the different options that are available for you, and you can choose for yourself what works best. You can also use this paint to add some more little hairs that are in the light on the nose, for example, working slowly to get the best line possible. Cat whiskers are so prominent and generally thicker than dog whiskers. So you want to make sure that they really stand out. And usually they are white. So understanding how to do this with all your different white options is going to be really helpful if you're trying to paint a cat in watercolor. So I need to do about 3 or 4 more short ones here at the bottom. So we'll just finish these up with our opaque white. And I wanted to show you all of these techniques on the same painting so that you could see just how you can actually use all of these different techniques in the same painting and still have a very cohesive look. All right, so now I'm going to show you the pencil. I'm going to use the pencils on the top of the cat, right above the eye here. We don't need a lot of white because we negative painted around a lot of our light brown there and did most of the work already. However, we can use our pencils to just really finish the whole look. So I'm going to start with the charcoal pencil. You want to make sure your paint is completely dry, of course. And you can see that it does leave a little bit of residue. That's one thing you have to watch out for. But it makes a really strong white mark. Works great on your watercolor paper over the top of your dry watercolor paint. So I'm adding those last little bits of fur. This is such a finishing detail. Definitely don't do this in the beginning stages of your painting because you'll end up covering it up, and what would be the point, right? And then I'll show you with this is a very thin white pencil, colored pencil. This is going to be a lot less intense of a white. So as I'm moving away from the focal point, I can use this for some of these lighter, I should say darker whites that are in the shadow more. You can see it's not quite as intense. And you can see the value of using a less intense white as you move away from your lit up areas. And then I'll switch back to the charcoal pencil for these bits of fur that are much brighter white. So if you do choose to use a charcoal or a colored pencil like this, you may want to seal your painting with some sort of watercolor varnish, and that way that'll prevent your charcoal pencil from smudging. But that's the look. We did it with 5 different methods of using white. We used the white of the paper, we negative painted around our highlights, we used masking fluid, we used opaque white paint, and we used colored pencils and white charcoal. I hope you're able to take away some really valuable tools to help you with your next painting involving white. Leave me a comment below if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, and I'd be happy to help. Check out this next video all about painting white animals, and I'll see you over there.